Thank you very much. I think most of the introduction has already been done for me by the distinguished moderator of this assembly. Anyway, Mr. Chairman, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, first of all I'd like to thank the Journal de Negócios and S.D.M for this conference and for inviting me to address you. As I say, I've already been introduced, but basically educated at the LSE, London University, then lectured at Liverpool University, afterwards working in the City of London for a leading stockbroker. And after a period in private business, I went to work for the Isle of Man government, ending up as head of the International Services Division of the Isle of Man Treasury, responsible for the promotion and development of the island's financial and professional services sectors. Since retirement from that role, I have acted as S.D.M's correspondent in the City of London and also the three island centres. My purpose today is to describe the three islands of Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man, and how and why their governments have sought to promote economic development. This may be of relevance or at least of interest to other areas in similar circumstances. The original motivation for the creation of the preferential tax regimes that exist in the islands and their encouragement by the United Kingdom government to proceed down this route was that no other instrument of economic development policy was likely to be as effective. As islands with small populations and remote from major markets, they would suffer from extremely high costs in attempting to compete in manufacturing, while their traditional industries of agriculture, fishing and so on, and tourism were obviously in long-term decline. They faced the issues that confront other small islands, which is that of large-scale emigration, particularly of young people, and for the United Kingdom there would have been huge costs associated with supporting these islands and their infrastructures. These costs the United Kingdom was neither able nor willing to bear at the time. So we'll move on now to the second slide. Which is basically to look at the agenda. It's pretty well self-explanatory. I'll say perhaps in terms of the economy a little bit more about the tax strategies that the islands have pursued, certainly in recent years. And I'll also stress perhaps the desire and the efforts that are being made to diversify the economies of the islands away from dependence upon a single major principal industry. So move on from there to the next slide, which is looking at the location and infrastructure that exists. Starting with the geographical location. In terms of the British Isles, the Isle of Man is centrally situated. It lies in the middle of the Irish Sea. The Channel Islands, in contrast, lie on the English Channel, but much closer to the French coast than to the English coast. However, if you look at the islands in terms of Europe, all are on the periphery of Europe, but none perhaps as remote as Madeira, which is located in mid-Atlantic, a long way from metropolitan Portugal. In terms of size, the Isle of Man is the largest, with an area of 229 square miles. Jersey is next with 45 square miles, and Guernsey is the smallest with 22 square miles. Their total area is not dissimilar to that of Madeira. In terms of their combined populations are about 230, 240,000. Again, they're perhaps slightly less than that of Madeira, but again very comparable. Interestingly enough, there's a very large Portuguese population, mainly from Madeira, estimated up to 10,000 living and working in Jersey. In terms of sea links and air links, these are good to the United Kingdom if expensive. Elsewhere they tend to be limited. The Isle of Man has good links with Ireland, while the Channel Islands have flights and ferry connections to France and flights to Switzerland. As one would expect, there is very easy accessibility from all three islands to the City of London. Moving on to the next slide. In terms of continuing with the theme of location infrastructure, the islands enjoy world-class electronic communications, and this is particularly important, as we shall see, for the Isle of Man, because of its rapidly growing e-commerce and e-gaming sectors. The islands have been able to finance from their own internal resources, without relying on anybody else, major investments in recent years in first-class education, health and welfare systems. They've also made considerable capital investments and expenditures on new airport and sea terminal facilities, new hospitals and schools, sewage systems, water and electricity plants, and waste incinerators. None of this would have been possible if economic development had not occurred to pay for it. Finally, I'd like to say something about the high quality of life that exists on the islands, with few social problems, attractive countryside, little crime, and low personal tax. The result is that businesses have no difficulty in attracting and retaining qualified, quality professional employees. This has over time created a critical mass of well-qualified and experienced staff. Per capita incomes are much higher than in the United Kingdom average, and similar to those of London and the southeast of England. The Isle of Man, for example, is estimated to have a per capita income 83% higher than that of the United Kingdom average. Turning now to the constitutional relationships with the United Kingdom and later with that of the European Union. Her Majesty the Queen is by custom given the titles of Lord of Man and Duke of Normandy, respectively. The Isle of Man first came under the English crown in the 14th century. However, the modern constitutional relationship between the British Crown and the island dates from 1866, when the revenues of the island were separated from the revenues of the United Kingdom. Neither the Isle of Man nor the Channel Islands have ever been part of the United Kingdom, nor of its constituent parts, England or Scotland. The Channel Islands, in fact, were part of the Duchy of Normandy when Duke William the Conqueror invaded and conquered England. Their ancient rights and privileges at that time were guaranteed by King John after the loss of Normandy to Philip II of France in 1204. So the islands are fiscally autonomous and of no cost to the UK, but they are not sovereign territories. Although the Lieutenant Governor, the Queen's representative on the islands, is largely a figurehead, the United Kingdom is ultimately responsible for their good government. This has never been defined, nor has it been an issue to the islands or to the UK. But it does mean that Britain has a vested interest in their success, or otherwise it would have to step in, administer and subsidise them heavily. All three islands have apparently archaic, but also very democratic systems of government. They are not represented in the UK Houses of Parliament, but have their own legislatures. In the Isle of Man's case, it's called Tynwald, which is the oldest continuous parliament in the world. In the Channel Islands case, the legislatures are called the states of Jersey and the states of Guernsey, respectively. From your history, you will remember that the local parliaments in pre-revolutionary France were called states, and it was the States General which met and deposed the French king. Finally, and most importantly, the three islands have their own legal systems, their own legal professions, and their own legislative competence. Moving on now to the next slide, the relationship with the European Union. The Crown Dependencies relationship with the European Union is set out in Protocol 3 of the United Kingdom Treaty of Accession of 1972. They are neither member states of the European Union nor associate members. Under the protocol, there is free trade access to the community. However, the other European Union rules do not apply, so the islands are not required to contribute to, nor do they receive any support from the European Union structural funds or agricultural support measures. The status of the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands is very similar. However, there are important differences in the field of indirect taxes. Although the Isle of Man has the statutory authority to levy its own rates of duty and taxes, a customs and excise agreement has existed for a long time between the United Kingdom and the Isle of Man, whereby the Isle of Man keeps its indirect taxes, such as value-added tax, aligned to those of the United Kingdom. No such agreement exists between the UK and Jersey or Guernsey. Through this agreement, the Isle of Man is fully integrated into the European Union single market for value-added tax purposes. Moving on to taxation strategies. Many people view the islands, their view of the islands is that they are tax havens or offshore finance centres. I imagine that's the overwhelming impression in continental Europe. If that were ever the case, it's far from true today. Nowadays, their clients will be major multinational corporate users, expatriates, wealthy families scattered all around the world, and others seeking the efficiencies, security, and opportunities which the islands offer. The growth of globalization, large-scale migration across borders, and the shifting balance of economic power to the newly industrialized or industrializing countries have given rise to a huge demand for their services. For certain types of business, the major finance centers like London and New York will be both sources of business to them, but also major competitors of the centers. In recent years, the islands have followed similar taxation policies. For company profits tax, it's known as 010. The basic rate of corporation tax is 0, the standard rate is 0, but certain regulated financial businesses pay 10%. In addition, there are certain other activities, principally involved with property, which attract a 10% rate. Many financial transactions, of course, and joint ventures require this tax neutrality. Besides being very competitive with other jurisdictions like Singapore and Hong Kong, it's also managed to remain compatible with the European Union's Code of Conduct. And again, I would make the point there is no withholding tax, as far as these islands are concerned, on distributions by companies of dividends, interest or royalties. The only area of withholding tax might be in relation to rents. Another element of the island's tax strategy is exchange of information. Within the European Union, where double tax treaties or information exchange agreements have been signed, there is now these agreements are now on an automatic basis. The islands have seen it as being in their best interest to cooperate with other countries to counter illegal activities, including tax evasion. As part of these agreements, there has been understandings that they are a preliminary step to the negotiation of full double taxation treaties, or at least the removal of the islands from any blacklists. The islands expect that these undertakings will be promptly honoured by their treaty partners. Finally, for individuals, there exist similar regimes with a top rate of 20%, generous allowances and lower rates, usually 10%. No capital taxes such as wealth taxes, capital duties, capital gains taxes or inheritance taxes exist, while income tax caps have been introduced. In the Isle of Man's case, the maximum amount of tax an individual will pay is $120,000, whatever the level of their income. Moving now to the next slide, which covers the island's economies, and this is, if you like, a profile of them. Historically, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the island's economies, as I've mentioned before, were largely based on agriculture, tourism and fishery. In the late 19th century, there was also a substantial mining industry in the Isle of Man. And while these industries continue to make some contribution, all these economies are now driven by international business or professional services, supplemented especially in the Isle of Man's case by high-tech manufacturing and e-gaming. Let's start with some basic information about the islands. All three islands enjoy excellent country ratings of either AA or AAA status. They have no national debts and considerable reserves. They've enjoyed long periods of continuous growth. They're not immune to what happens elsewhere, but at least they start from the basis that they have no debt and they have considerable reserves to cushion any adjustments that need to be made. Because of the 2008 crisis, there was a modest decline in Jersey and Guernsey in 2009-10. But in the Isle of Man's case, there has been 27 years now of continuous economic growth, whilst unemployment is negligible. They are prosperous and attractive places with per capita incomes, as I've mentioned, well above the United Kingdom and European Union averages. I've given the gross national income or gross domestic product figures for 2010, depending on which were available. They are based on income tax returns and therefore inevitably a little dated. Right, moving on now to the principal industries on the islands. Firstly, bank deposits. The modern banking industry on the islands really started in the 1960s. Jersey was the first, and as you can see from the slide, is still the largest banking centre, with 158 billion on deposit in December 2011. Jersey is followed by Guernsey with 113 billion on deposit, although about 40 billion of that reflects fiduciary deposits placed in Guernsey by Swiss banks, essentially designed to avoid Switzerland's withholding taxes. And finally, the Isle of Man has 47 billion on deposit. Since 2008, all three centres have experienced some decline in banking activity, deposits and employment in their banking sectors. Modest declines. Moving on now to insurance and managed funds. Although all three islands are similar, as the slide illustrates, they do have relative areas of strength. As with banking, the Channel Islands are very strong in collective investment schemes and fund management. In contrast, the Isle of Man has a life and pensions industry which is not replicated in either Jersey or Guernsey. Both Guernsey and the Isle of Man do have, in addition, substantial captive insurance industries. In addition to the pure funds activities, the islands are also active in the AIM market in London. Probably more than 50% of the companies quoted on the AIM market in London are in fact companies which are incorporated in Jersey, Guernsey or the Isle of Man. While in the Channel Islands there is a recognised Channel Islands Stock Exchange, which has been successfully established and is now very active. Moving on now to the attempts to diversify. In the Isle of Man's case, who've probably been the most successful in this area, this really started with the creation of a Category 1 merchant shipping register. This, in fact, both Jersey and Guernsey, in fact, have not really bothered with Category 1 registers, and they limit themselves in terms of merchant vessels to 400 gross tons and 150 tons respectively, which would cover the small workboats, tugs, fishing boats that they register. The Isle of Man at the end of last year had 419 merchant vessels on its registers, its main register and its bareboat register, totaling 13.8 million gross tons. According to Clarkson's world rankings, the Isle of Man register moved up from 18th to 15th place during 2011. Despite the worldwide problems faced by the shipping industries, the Isle of Man continues to make progress and to exceed its targets in this area. And the most important thing here is that although the register has made progress and it is significant, it's resulted in the creation of an entire industry covering such diverse activities as shipping and crew management, chartering, technical management, ship finance, legal services and banking. Regarding commercial yachts, again the Isle of Man is dominant. It now has 103 super yachts above 24 metres on its commercial register. In advance of the United Kingdom, it introduced the large yacht codes LYC1 and LYC2, which have become industry standards. It employs 30 specialist surveyors for both merchant vessels and yachts, and has been extremely successful. Although both Guernsey and Jersey have substantial numbers of pleasure craft on their registers, they have not competed with the Isle of Man in terms of commercial yachts. Jersey, in fact, has 28 super yachts, but those super yachts, in fact, are all pleasure ones. Finally, I'd make a mention of the aircraft register, which the Isle of Man established in 2007. It now has a total of approximately 350 aircraft registered. It's registered over 475 in total, but of course you get deletions and so on. The registry again has brought a huge amount of work to local service providers, banks, lawyers, corporate service providers, etc. It's led to the establishment of specialist firms who engage in aircraft maintenance. The aircraft that are registered there include airliner variants produced by both Boeing and Airbus. And of course, even commercial aircraft are registered while they're not being used commercially, whether when they're parked or whether they are sort of parked between leases. Right, moving on now to companies. This slide shows the number of active companies registered in each of the three islands at the end of 2011. This is one indicator of the health of their trust and company management sectors. In addition, of course, they administer a large number of companies incorporated in other jurisdictions. The numbers that they administer from other jurisdictions probably exceed the numbers registered in the Isle of Man. In recent years, there's been a tendency for the number of companies incorporated in each jurisdiction to fall. Increasing compliance requirements, intrusive anti-money laundering legislation, increased costs have driven some business away to less regulated centres. In the Isle of Man's case, this prompted in 2006 the introduction of a new corporate vehicle which has limited the loss of business. Right, moving on to again to areas of diversification, and the figures in this slide are provided by from the Isle of Man National Income Accounts published by the Economic Affairs Division of the Treasury. Basically, as far as internet gaming is concerned, although Alderney has a few licensed gaming sites, in view of its small size and minuscule population, very little work is actually carried out in Alderney itself. But internet gaming has been the success story of the past few years as far as the Isle of Man is concerned, with growth rates in excess of 57% in 2009-10 and 40% in 2010-11. Its contribution to the island's economy is now in excess of 9%. As can be seen from the slide, it now exceeds manufacturing to a considerable extent. Turning to manufacturing, this again is mainly restricted to the Isle of Man. To some extent it makes a steady contribution to the economy of about 5%. It has benefited from the weakness of sterling. There is a strong aerospace engineering cluster located in the Isle of Man, linked to major manufacturers in the UK. And that has been very successful in penetrating high-tech markets. Its growth, in fact, is more limited by the availability of skilled engineering labour, although there are at least 1,000 skilled people working in the industry, than by any other factor, including demand. The Isle of Man continues to diversify, whether it be into film production or commercial space exploitation, with a large number of the firms working in the space industry located on the island, including Inmarsat, SES, Avanti and Telesat. Mansat, a local company, has a contract to administer the orbital filing system, which allows companies to identify slots in space in which they want to place their satellites. Also, there are the Institute of Space Commerce, the University of Space, in fact, in Strasbourg, has opened an Institute of Space Commerce in the Isle of Man. Right, let's move on now to the drivers for past success. Why have these islands been successful? To a large extent, the answer is that they were lucky and entered these markets when the demand for international services was extremely buoyant due to global deregulation and liberalisation, coupled with strong economic expansion. Earlier I touched on general infrastructure, again extremely important. On this slide I've listed some of the other factors. One essential precondition for success has been government support and encouragement. As far as business is concerned, it requires certainty. It does not like unpleasant surprises. Trust once lost is very difficult, if not impossible, to regain. First-class reputations have been built by embracing international standards of financial regulation, avoiding scandals, and providing excellent services to clients. Intelligent and experienced people will have noticed that the financial collapses and scandals which occurred in 2008 were all initiated in major onshore jurisdictions like the USA, the European Union and the United Kingdom, and not the island's economies. I would refer, in fact, people to a number of studies that, in fact, have been done on this subject. One was the Foote Report, commissioned by Alistair Darling, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer in the United Kingdom, which was extremely positive, and also that by the Financial Services Authority, Lord Turner. So moving on now, I'd attribute also a major part of their success to the enterprise, drive and initiative of the communities, the business communities in the three islands. So finally, some conclusions. Guernsey, Jersey and the Isle of Man are examples of how small islands have reinvented themselves in the post-war period so as to offset the decline in traditional industries, to manoeuvre to reposition themselves, to identify and cater for the huge and growing market for cross-border financial and other services. The growth in the BRICS has created huge numbers of wealthy people who use the services of the island. It's estimated that the Crown dependencies have managed to secure 5% of this huge global market. The market comes via, in many cases, the City of London, and having the city on its doorstep, the biggest offshore market perhaps in the world, is a big boost in terms of potential business. The links to the city are vital. They work two ways. First, London acts as a source of business. Law firms from all the islands have offices in the city. Referrals are also frequently made to local firms by London-based solicitors and other professionals. Secondly, the islands banks have become a vital source of funds for the United Kingdom head offices and for the United Kingdom, especially when they aggregate client deposits and for the purposes of liquidity and risk management place them back in London. The Foot report that I've already mentioned calculated the islands provided something like $332.5 billion of net financing to UK banks in 2009-10. This, plus the other reasons already mentioned, means that the islands continue to remain a vital interest to the United Kingdom. Finally, I would stress that the success of the islands depends more than ever on the active support and encouragement given to their business communities by the governments, and also the continuing ingenuity and innovativeness of the islands' business communities. I'm confident that these factors will continue, and the islands will continue to enjoy success. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.